2020, coronavirus. This year we have lived through something that we never thought we would in our lifetime, a global pandemic. Obviously, it came to us at an extremely unexpected time, and no one was prepared for what was about to come or how the world was about to change.
Once the voyages began, most notably the Columbian Exchange, technology, animals, plants, and other goods were not the only thing traded between people. They were aided by a deadly secret weapon they weren't even aware they were carrying, the disease.
Numerous diseases and plagues like measles, smallpox, typhus, cholera, and influenza were spread to inhabitants who carried no immunity to these illnesses. Native Americans had lived in isolation, and the Europeans shattered the protection that the isolation had brought them. Their world was about to change significantly, and there was no way of stopping it. It's safe to say that they were effectively doomed.
Not only did these illnesses have detrimental effects to the health of individuals, but they substantially impacted populations as well as the nature of society politically and socially.
Just to put into perspective how devastating the diseases were to the population, it is estimated that epidemics claimed around the lives of about 85% of indigenous peoples within the first 100 to 150 years following 1492. That means around 55 million people died. 55 million. Today you could wipe out the whole country of Canada and still you would have to kill 18 million people to amount to that. Typical Native American societies had 90% of their population decimated. Some lost their full populations, and the young and elderly were most vulnerable. Loss of the older generations meant traditions and knowledge dwindled, which only aided the Europeans in converting them to Christianity.
In South America, European migration wreaked havoc on Aztec, Incan, and Mayan empires, nearly being wiped out by smallpox. This is because of the densely settled nature of the region. The massive amount of casualties allowed Spanish forces to easily take over the area. For other regions like the Great Plains, the spread was a little less severe since it was sparsely inhabited. This leads us into our first major disease, smallpox.
Here we have a picture of Native American Aztec people of Mexico dying of smallpox introduced by the Spaniards. Smallpox is highly contagious, disfiguring, and more often than not, deadly. It is characterized by having a lofty temperature and a distinctive skin rash that leaves pock marks behind. Headaches, backaches, and vomiting were common symptoms. It was believed to have arrived by a Spanish ship carrying an infected slave, affecting the Aztecs first, and then it effectively spread throughout the continent. It was the deadliest of the diseases that the Europeans had brought with them. On average, every 3 out of 10 people who contracted it would die. Toribio de Benavente Motolinía was a missionary that was a witness to the outbreak, and the Aztecs wrote, "As the Indians did not know the remedy of the disease, they died in heaps like bedbugs. In many places, it happened that everyone in a house died, and it was impossible to bury the great number of dead. They pulled down the houses over them so that their homes became their tombs." If that doesn't sound morbid and depressing to you, then I don't know what would. In the early 1630s, it detonated among the Algonquin tribe in Massachusetts. It eventually wiped out half of the Cherokee, the Omahas, the Mandans, and many more. You might be wondering how these devastating events were reacted to, but we'll get to that in a little bit.
The next disease we're going to talk about is measles. Measles is a highly contagious and infectious respiratory disease. Symptoms don't appear until 10 to 14 days after contraction, making contamination and spread easy. They include cough, runny nose, inflamed eyes, sore throat, fever, and a blotchy red skin rash. It is said to have originated from animals like cattle. Today, it is extremely rare with less than 1,000 cases per year.
Next is typhus. Typhus is a series of infectious diseases that appear with sudden headache, chills, fever, and general pains, and then eventually a rash. It's transmitted to humans via lice, mites, fleas, or ticks.
Another disease is cholera. It is a bacterial disease that causes severe diarrhea and dehydration, and it is usually spread by water. Once again, today it is extremely rare with also less than 1,000 cases per year.
The last disease we'll touch upon is influenza, or by its more common name, the flu. To us, it's that nasty infection that we have to get a shot for every year. The one that makes you feel like you legitimately can't get out of bed. But luckily, it's not notably lethal, and the vast majority of people recover within 1 to 2 weeks. But for Native Americans, on the other hand, it was a different story. Just like all the other diseases, millions died from it. And because so many lives were lost, this meant that the free labor the Europeans had once exploited was gone. So consequently, the Atlantic slave trade started.
Diseases tended to explode in sudden and overwhelming outbreaks of infection and death. Obviously, there was no modern medicine, so everyone was at the mercy of themselves. Many indigenous people perceived disease as a weapon used by hostile spiritual forces, and they went to war to exorcise the diseases from their midst. These wars were designed to gain captives who would either be adopted or ritually tortured and executed as a way to elevate the anger and grief caused by loss.
During the 1700s, the Plains tribes believed that smallpox was a personification of the bad spirit. Disease was commonly thought of as a punishment by the master of life for mistreatment of animals and other people. The Creeks and Cherokees believed the spread of smallpox was a punishment and for violations of tribal laws. Animal spirits were blamed, it was anger from God. Also, according to the Cherokees, animals created diseases to protect themselves from humans.
Additionally, witchcraft was a popular explanation among tribes. This resulted in accused individuals being tortured or killed. Some blamed members of their own communities or white missionaries for witchcraft. Back to trade. It was easily the main thing that facilitated the spread. Participation in the Canadian fur trade, the Hudson Bay Company, and Euro-American fur brigades often brought infection to main centers, which just carried more disease to the affiliated trade routes. An acquired desire for Europeans' goods through the conversions to Christianity also increased participation in trade.
As we mentioned earlier, obviously there was no modern medicine or vaccine you could take to prevent these diseases, so Native Americans used their own methods of treatment. The most common method was the sweat lodge. Willow bark was steamed in a lodge acting as an analgesic or a painkiller, and then conifer oils acting as decongestants. The Cherokees adopted a similar approach because they believed that plants had healing powers. But the herbs they used were cathartics and emetics, which caused profuse sweating, which would lead to dehydration. After a session in the lodge, people would usually submerge themselves in cold water, which would cause cardiac arrest and shock, which actually ended up lowering their immunity to infections.
Native Americans responded to the mass population loss within their own tribal groups and families. An unfortunate common response was suicide, which only increased the mortality rates. Grief was partnered with starvation.
The great loss of people obstructed subsistence, defense, and cultural roles. Population loss forced the fusion of residential groups, creating diffusions of culture. Overall, the collective knowledge of history and ceremony reduced as well. A long-term effect of smallpox was decreased fertility in survivors, which kept population numbers low even long after the epidemic had passed. Other effects were blindness and pockmarks. More of the people of the New World who were victims of colonization were killed by Eurasian germs than by either the gun or the sword, making germs the deadliest form of conquest.
Fortunately, today, we can avoid mass amounts of death and disease on this scale thanks to advances in innovation in technology and medicine. Although there are still countless illnesses that plague our world, we have progressively made it safer and hopefully will continue to do so. I mean, just think about how fast we were able to create a vaccine for COVID. Gave us a lifeline to this expansion. Once the voyages began, most no.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
No, it doesn't.
He's like a walking blueberry. Diseases tended to explode in sudden and overwhelming outbreaks of infection and death. Oh, that was so insensitive. Another disease is cholera. It is a bacterial disease that causes... No, I'm not doing this one, Sophia!